Thick plumes of smoke blanketed the sky over Los Angeles, casting an ominous orange glow on the city below. As fire trucks roared through the streets, their sirens competing with the crackling roar of flames, one figure stood out in the chaos. Barron Trump, dressed simply in jeans and a t-shirt, was at the center of a makeshift relief camp, organizing supplies and speaking with desperate evacuees. His voice was calm, but his eyes reflected the urgency of the moment. "We can't just wait for help to come," he said to a group of volunteers. "We need to go in and get those people out now." The wildfires had started days earlier, sparked by a dry lightning storm that ignited the brittle brush of the Los Angeles hills. What began as a small, contained blaze quickly grew into an uncontrollable inferno, driven by high winds and scorching summer heat. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated as the flames consumed homes and spread across the city's outskirts. News channels broadcasted harrowing images of fire trucks racing against time, firefighters battling walls of flames, and families fleeing with whatever they could carry. Relief centers were set up in school gyms and community centers, but the sheer scale of the disaster left many in desperate situations. Barron Trump watched the coverage from his home. While the world focused on the destruction, he noticed something else: people falling through the cracks. Families left stranded, elderly residents unable to evacuate, and overwhelmed shelters running out of basic supplies. "This isn't enough," he muttered to himself. "People need more than just waiting for help, they need action." The relief camp was nothing like the orderly operations Barron had seen on TV. Located in a repurposed high school gymnasium, it was a chaotic, overcrowded hub of despair and determination. Families huddled in clusters, surrounded by piles of hastily packed belongings. Volunteers darted between groups, distributing food and water, while the faint cries of children echoed through the space. Barron arrived early in the morning, dressed simply in jeans and a t-shirt. He wanted no fanfare, no special treatment. This wasn't about his name, it was about what he could do. The moment he stepped inside, he was struck by the sheer scale of the crisis. "Excuse me," he said, approaching a volunteer who was unloading a truck of supplies. "Where can I help?" The woman, frazzled but grateful, handed him a clipboard. "We're short on hands at the distribution table," she said. "Can you manage that?" Barron nodded. "Of course." For hours, Barron worked tirelessly, organizing boxes of canned goods, bottled water, and blankets. He greeted each evacuee with a kind word and a reassuring smile, but the stories he heard weighed heavily on him. One elderly woman shuffled forward, leaning on a cane. "I don't know where my son is," she said, her voice trembling. "We got separated during the evacuation." Barron paused, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll find him," he said gently. "Let's make sure you're taken care of first." A young mother approached next, her toddler clinging to her leg. "We lost everything," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Our house, it's gone." Barron knelt down to meet the child's gaze. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice soft. "We're going to make sure you and your mom have everything you need." Word of Barron's presence spread quickly through the camp. Some evacuees whispered his name with surprise, while others regarded him with skepticism. "What's he doing here?" a man muttered to his wife. "Is this just for the cameras?" But Barron's actions soon silenced the doubts. He wasn't standing idly by or issuing commands from a distance. He was in the thick of it, stacking boxes, comforting evacuees, and listening to their stories. At one point, a volunteer approached him, a clipboard in hand. "We're running low on bottled water," she said. "If we don't get more soon, we'll be in trouble." Barron didn't hesitate. "Who's your supplier?" he asked. She gave him the contact information, and within minutes, he was on the phone, securing an emergency shipment. As the day wore on, the mood in the camp began to shift. Barron's presence, once met with uncertainty, became a source of reassurance. His calm demeanor and willingness to take action inspired both the volunteers and the evacuees. At one point, he noticed a group of teenagers sitting quietly in a corner. They looked lost, their eyes downcast. Barron grabbed a few bottles of water and walked over to them. "Hey," he said, sitting down on the floor beside them. "You guys doing okay?" One of the teens, a boy about 16, shrugged. "We don't know where to go," he said. "Our neighborhood's gone." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's tough right now, but you're not alone. We're going to figure this out together." The boy glanced at him, his skepticism giving way to a faint smile. "Thanks," he said quietly. As evening approached, Barron spotted a family sitting near the entrance of the gym. The parents looked exhausted, their teenage daughter clutching a small backpack tightly to her chest. Something about their demeanor caught his attention. He walked over, crouching to their level. "Hi, I'm Barron. Are you guys okay?" The father looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and desperation. "We're alive," he said. "But barely. We shouldn't be here. We should still be at home." "What do you mean?" Barron asked, his brow furrowing. The father took a deep breath. "When the fire started, we were told evacuation buses would come for us. But they never did. We waited as long as we could, but the fire got too close. We had to run." The mother's voice broke as she added, "There were others who couldn't leave." "They're still there, Barron." Barron's stomach churned. He could see the guilt and pain etched on their faces. "Why didn't anyone help you?" The father shook his head. "We don't know. We just know we can't go back." That night, Barron couldn't sleep. He sat outside the camp under the dim glow of a streetlight, replaying the Ramirez family's story in his mind. He thought about the people they'd left behind, the ones who hadn't made it out. They were more than statistics, they were families, friends, neighbors. And they were running out of time. "We can't wait," he whispered to himself. "We have to act." The Ramirez family sat in a corner of the relief camp, their belongings piled haphazardly around them. Marcus Ramirez, a wiry man in his 40s, rubbed his temples as his wife, Elena, quietly comforted their teenage daughter, Sophia. The family looked utterly drained, physically and emotionally. Barron noticed them almost immediately. While the other evacuees moved through the camp, collecting supplies or speaking with volunteers, the Ramirezes seemed paralyzed, lost in their own private world of grief. He approached cautiously, holding a tray of bottled water and granola bars. "Hi, I'm Barron," he said gently. "Can I sit with you?" Marcus looked up, his eyes filled with exhaustion and suspicion. "You're Trump, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Barron nodded. "Yeah. But today, I'm just here to help. Is there anything you need?" Elena exchanged a glance with Marcus before speaking. "We don't even know where to start," she said, her voice breaking. As the family began to share their story, Barron listened intently, his expression grave. "When the fire started, they told us to stay put," Marcus said, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "They said evacuation buses would come for us, that we'd be safe. But no one came." Elena picked up where he left off. "The fire was so close. We could feel the heat through the windows. We packed what we could and ran." Sophia, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. "There were people who couldn't leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "An old man down the street, families with little kids, we left them behind." Her words hit Barron like a punch to the gut. He had seen the news reports, the maps of evacuation zones, and the endless lists of displaced families. But hearing it firsthand, from people who had lived through it, made it real in a way that no statistic ever could. "Why didn't anyone help you?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Marcus shook his head. "We're not from here. We don't have money, connections. To them, we didn't matter." Barron felt a surge of frustration. How could something like this happen in a city with so many resources? He knew the fire crews were overwhelmed and that relief efforts were stretched thin, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. "Are there still people in your neighborhood?" he asked, his tone urgent. Marcus hesitated before nodding. Probably. We saw some of them trying to barricade their homes when we left. They didn't have anywhere else to go. Barron's jaw tightened. We need to get them out. Elena looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You can't go back there, she said. It's too dangerous. The fire's unpredictable and the roads are blocked. That's exactly why we have to act, Barron replied. If we don't, who will? That evening, Barron gathered the camp's volunteers and nonprofit leaders for an emergency meeting. The Ramirez family's story had shaken him, and he was determined to take action. We have people trapped in one of the evacuation zones, he began, his voice steady but intense. They were left behind during the evacuation, and the fire is closing in. We need to get them out. The room fell silent. Finally, one of the volunteers, an older man named Greg, spoke up. I understand your urgency, but do you know what you're asking? That area is a tinderbox. The fire's moving faster than the predictions. Barron met his gaze without flinching. I know it's dangerous. But waiting isn't an option. We've already secured trucks, supplies, and maps of the area. If we plan this carefully, we can get in and out before the fire reaches them. A woman at the back of the room raised her hand. Who's going to drive those trucks? She asked skeptically. Most of us aren't trained for this. I'll lead the convoy, Barron said firmly. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the nonprofit coordinators stepped forward, his face pale. Barron, with all due respect, this is insane. If something happens to you... Barron cut him off. This isn't about me. It's about the people who are still out there. If we don't do something now, we'll be reading about them in the obituaries tomorrow. The room buzzed with nervous energy as the volunteers debated the plan. Some were eager to help, inspired by Barron's determination. Others were hesitant, worried about the risks. Look, Barron said, addressing the group. I understand if you're scared. I am too. But this isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right. Every minute we wait, those people are in greater danger. If you're willing to help, meet me at the trucks in 30 minutes. Slowly, hands began to rise. Greg was the first to step forward. I'm in, he said gruffly. Let's do this. One by one, others followed. By the end of the meeting, a small but determined group had committed to the mission. The rest of the night was a whirlwind of activity. Maps were spread across tables, with volunteers marking the safest routes into the evacuation zone. Supplies were loaded into trucks, water, food, medical kits, and breathing masks. Barron worked tirelessly alongside the others, double-checking every detail. When the Ramirez family approached him, Sophia handed him a small notebook. These are the names of the people we know are still there, she said. Please, don't let them be forgotten. Barron took the notebook, his expression solemn. We won't, he promised. As the sun began to rise, the convoy was ready. The vehicles were packed, the routes planned, and the volunteers united by a single purpose, to save the lives of those who had been left behind. The Ramirez family's story lingered in Barron's mind long after the sun had set. Sitting outside the relief camp under a canopy of stars dimmed by smoke, he replayed their words over and over. There were others who couldn't leave. Each time, it fueled his determination. Inside the camp's meeting room, Barron called together the nonprofit leaders, volunteers, and anyone willing to listen. The air was thick with tension as they crowded around a folding table cluttered with maps and supply lists. We have a chance to save lives, Barron began, his voice steady but urgent. People were left behind during the evacuation. They're still in the fire zone, and they're running out of time. The group exchanged uneasy glances. A middle-aged volunteer named Greg broke the silence. Barron, I respect what you're trying to do, but you don't understand how bad it is out there. The roads are blocked, the fire's unpredictable, it's a death trap. I know it's dangerous, Barron replied, meeting Greg's gaze. But doing nothing isn't an option. If we don't act, those people won't make it out alive." The room buzzed with murmurs of dissent. Some nodded in agreement with Greg, while others looked to Barron with a mixture of admiration and doubt. One of the nonprofit leaders, a woman named Angela, spoke up. "We've already pushed our resources to the limit. Organizing a rescue mission like this, it's a huge risk. What if something goes wrong?" Barron took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the table. "I understand the risks. But I also understand what's at stake. These are people's lives we're talking about, families, children, elderly neighbors. They need us now more than ever." Angela hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If we're going to do this, we need a solid plan." Barron unfolded a large map of the affected area, spreading it across the table. Using reports from evacuees and emergency updates from local authorities, the group identified potential routes into the fire zone. "This road here," Barron said, pointing to a narrow side street, "is still passable according to the latest updates. It'll take us close to the neighborhood where the Ramirez family lived." Greg leaned over the map, frowning. "That's a tight route. If the fire shifts, we could get trapped." "That's why we need backup plans," Barron said, drawing alternate routes on the map. "And we'll need radios to stay in constant communication." Angela added, "We'll also need breathing masks, medical supplies, and enough water for both the volunteers and the evacuees." The group worked late into the night, fine-tuning the details. Despite their initial hesitation, a sense of unity began to take hold. Once the plan was set, Barron addressed the room. "We can't do this without you," he said, looking around at the volunteers. "I'm not asking anyone to risk their life lightly. But if you're willing to help, meet me at the trucks in 2 hours." The room fell silent. Then Greg stood up, his jaw set. "I'll drive one of the trucks," he said. "Let's get this done." One by one, others followed. A young woman who had been helping with food distribution raised her hand. "Count me in," she said. Soon, a small but determined team had assembled. Their faces reflected a mix of fear and resolve, but they were ready. The hours leading up to the mission were a flurry of activity. Supplies were loaded into trucks with military precision: cases of water, boxes of non-perishable food, medical kits, and fire blankets. Volunteers tested the radios, ensuring they could stay in contact even in the thickest smoke. Barron worked alongside the others, hauling boxes and double-checking equipment. Despite the gravity of the situation, his calm demeanor kept the group focused. At one point, Sofia Ramirez approached him with a piece of paper. "These are the names of some of the people who couldn't leave," she said. "Please find them." Barron took the list, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. "We'll do everything we can," he promised. As dawn approached, the convoy was ready. 3 trucks, each packed to capacity, idled near the edge of the camp. The volunteers gathered for a final briefing. "Stick to the plan," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. "If the fire shifts or the roads become impassable, we turn back. No one takes unnecessary risks." Greg nodded. "Understood. Let's get those people out of there." Barron glanced at the sky, which was beginning to lighten with the first rays of morning. "This is it," he said. "Let's bring them home." As the convoy pulled out of the camp, the volunteers felt a surge of adrenaline. They were heading into the unknown, but they carried with them the hope of saving lives. Barron sat in the lead truck, his mind focused on the task ahead. For the first time since the fires began, he felt a sense of purpose, not as the son of a famous family, but as someone who could make a real difference. The convoy rumbled out of the relief camp just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow on the smoke-filled sky. 3 trucks, loaded with supplies and staffed by determined volunteers, moved cautiously toward the evacuation zone. Barron sat in the lead truck beside Greg, who gripped the wheel with a mixture of determination and anxiety. "We stick to the plan," Barron reminded the group over the radio. "No detours, no unnecessary risks. If the fire cuts us off, we pull back immediately." The radios crackled with affirmations from the other drivers. They were scared. How could they not be? But the thought of people trapped in the fire's path gave them the courage to press on. The first leg of the journey was relatively uneventful. The roads were clear, though the air was thick with smoke. Barron kept an eye on the GPS, cross-referencing it with the maps they had studied the night before. "This next turn should take us closer to the Ramirez neighborhood," he said, pointing ahead. Greg nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "I've been through some rough places, but this is something else." As they approached the fire zone, the devastation became increasingly evident. Charred trees lined the road, their blackened limbs stretching skyward like skeletal hands. Burned-out cars sat abandoned along the shoulder, and the faint smell of ash and destruction filled the air. "Keep your eyes open," Barron said over the radio. "We're getting close." When they arrived at the Ramirez family's neighborhood, the scene was haunting. Smoke billowed from nearby hills, and the distant roar of the fire was a constant reminder of the danger they faced. The volunteers spread out, each assigned to a specific section of the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, shouted into windows, and called out for anyone who might still be inside. Barron led a small group to the end of the street, where a modest home still stood amid the ash. He pounded on the door, his voice urgent. "Is anyone in there? We're here to help." After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man leaning on a walker. His face was streaked with soot, and his eyes were wide with fear. "Thank God," the man whispered. "I didn't think anyone would come." Barron helped him onto the porch, where volunteers wrapped him in a fire blanket and escorted him to one of the trucks. Over the next hour, the convoy rescued more people, an older couple who had been too scared to leave, a young mother and her 2 children huddled in a basement, and a man with a broken leg who had been unable to escape on his own. Each rescue was a race against time. The fire was unpredictable, its movements dictated by the wind. Barron's radio buzzed constantly with updates from the other volunteers. "We've got a family of 4 on Birch Street," one voice reported. "They're coming out now." "There's a woman on Elm who refuses to leave," another said. "She says she'll wait for her husband." "What do we do?" Barron pressed the button on his radio. "Convince her. Tell her we can't come back if the fire shifts." As the last evacuee was loaded into the trucks, the fire began to move closer. Embers danced in the air, carried by the wind, and the heat was palpable even from a distance. "We've got to move," Greg shouted. "The road's not going to hold much longer." Barron scanned the area one last time, ensuring no one was left behind. "All units, fall back," he said into the radio. "Let's get out of here." The convoy began its retreat, navigating the narrow streets as quickly as possible. But just as they reached the main road, a downed tree blocked their path. "Road's blocked," Greg said, panic creeping into his voice. "What do we do?" Barron didn't hesitate. "We backtrack to the alternate route. Stay close and keep the radios on." The trucks reversed and turned onto a secondary road, their tires kicking up ash as they sped away from the advancing flames. The fire was now dangerously close, its orange glow illuminating the darkened sky. Barron's radio crackled with updates from the rear truck. "We're clear so far, but the smoke's getting thicker. Visibility's dropping." "Keep moving," Barron replied. "We're almost there." As they approached the edge of the evacuation zone, the road opened up, and the air grew slightly clearer. The convoy burst through the final stretch, emerging into safety just as the fire engulfed the area they had left behind. The volunteers exchanged looks of relief and disbelief. They had made it out, but just barely. When the convoy returned to the relief camp, they were met with cheers and applause. The rescued families were immediately escorted to the medical tents, where doctors and nurses assessed their condition. Barron stepped out of the lead truck, his face streaked with soot but calm. He watched as the Ramirez family reunited with their neighbors, tears of relief streaming down their faces. "You did it," Sophia said, running up to him. "You brought them back." Barron smiled, his exhaustion evident but his resolve unshaken. "We all did," he replied. This was a team effort. As the sun set over the camp, the volunteers gathered to reflect on what they had accomplished. Despite the risks, they had saved dozens of lives, people who might otherwise have been lost to the flames. Greg approached Barron, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've got guts, kid. I didn't think we'd pull it off, but you proved me wrong." Barron nodded. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about doing what was right. The fire had taken so much from the city, but in that moment, it felt like they had reclaimed a small piece of hope. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with smoke that stung their eyes and clawed at their throats. The convoy of trucks had successfully loaded the last of the evacuees, but the danger was far from over. As they began their retreat, the fire shifted, driven by sudden gusts of wind that sent embers spiraling into the sky. Barron sat in the lead truck, his eyes scanning the mirrors and the road ahead. "How's everyone holding up?" he asked over the radio, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We're clear for now," Greg replied from the second truck. "But the fire's moving fast. We don't have much time." The road was narrow, flanked by towering trees that were already beginning to smolder. Barron gripped the dashboard as the truck swerved to avoid a fallen branch. "Keep tight," he said into the radio. "We're almost out of the worst of it." As they approached the main road, the lead truck came to an abrupt halt. A massive tree had fallen across the path, its charred trunk still smoldering. Barron jumped out of the truck, covering his mouth with a damp cloth as he surveyed the blockage. "We can't go through," Greg said, pulling up behind him. "What now?" Barron didn't hesitate. "We take the alternate route. Everyone stay close and keep your radios on. We can't afford to get separated." The convoy reversed and turned onto a narrow side road, the only other way out of the fire zone. But the flames were relentless, creeping closer with every passing minute. The side road was barely wide enough for the trucks. Smoke obscured their vision, reducing their speed to a crawl. Barron leaned out of the window, directing Greg and the other drivers as they navigated the treacherous path. "Slow and steady," he said over the radio. "Visibility's bad, but we're still moving." The evacuees in the back of the trucks were silent, their fear palpable. A young boy clung to his mother, his wide eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. In the third truck, one of the volunteers reported trouble. "We're overheating," she said, her voice strained. "The engine's struggling in this heat." Barron's mind raced. "Turn off the AC and keep the windows cracked," he instructed. "We'll make it through." As the convoy rounded a bend, the fire loomed dangerously close. Flames licked at the edges of the road, sending waves of heat that made the air shimmer. The trucks pressed on, their tires crunching over ash and debris. "Barron," Greg's voice crackled over the radio, the wind's picking up. "This whole area's about to go up." "I know," Barron replied, his tone calm but firm. "Just keep moving. We're almost there." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air as a burning tree toppled onto the road behind the convoy, cutting off their escape route. Barron glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart pounding. "We've got no way back," Greg said. "It's forward or nothing." Barron grabbed the radio. "Everyone stay focused. Keep moving forward, no matter what." The trucks pressed on, the flames licking dangerously close to the sides of the vehicles. Embers rained down, landing on the hoods and windshields. Volunteers in the back of the trucks used fire blankets to extinguish the glowing cinders before they could catch. In the lead truck, Barron spotted a clearing ahead. "That's our exit," he said, pointing. "Once we're through there, we'll hit open ground." The convoy sped up, the vehicles jostling over the uneven terrain. The clearing grew closer, but so did the fire. The heat was unbearable, and the roar of the flames drowned out everything else. With one final push, the convoy burst through the clearing and onto a wide, paved road. The fire was behind them now, a glowing inferno that lit up the night sky. The evacuees cheered, their relief palpable as the trucks pulled to a stop at a safe distance. Barron climbed out of the lead truck, his face streaked with soot but calm. He looked back at the fire, then at the evacuees who were now hugging one another, their tears a mix of joy and exhaustion. "We did it," Greg said, clapping Barron on the shoulder. "I didn't think we'd make it, but you pulled us through." Barron shook his head. "We all did. This was a team effort." As the convoy regrouped, the volunteers checked on the evacuees, distributing water and tending to minor injuries. Despite their success, the weight of what they had just experienced hung heavy in the air. One of the evacuees, an elderly woman rescued from her home, approached Barron. She took his hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." Barron nodded, his throat tight. "You're safe now," he said simply. The fire had taken so much from so many, but in that moment, it felt like they had won a small but meaningful victory. Later that night, back at the relief camp, Barron sat alone on the steps of the gymnasium. The sky was still hazy, the stars obscured by smoke. He thought about the people they had saved, the risks they had taken, and the lives that would go on because of their efforts. Greg joined him, handing over a bottle of water. "You did good, kid," he said. Barron took a sip, his gaze distant. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone who believed we could make a difference." Greg nodded. "Still, you led us through. That's something." As the camp quieted down, Barron allowed himself a moment of rest. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more people to help, more lives to rebuild. But for now, he was content knowing they had made a difference. Back at the relief camp, the rescued families were greeted with cheers and tears of joy. News of the mission spread quickly, and soon reporters arrived to document the story. When asked about his role, Barron downplayed his actions. "This wasn't about me," he said. "It was about doing what needed to be done. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." His humility only added to the admiration he received. Social media lit up with hashtags like #BarronTheHero and #LeadershipInAction, and even his critics acknowledged the bravery of his actions. In the weeks that followed, Barron continued his work with relief organizations, using his platform to raise awareness and funds for wildfire victims. His actions inspired others to step up, proving that leadership isn't about power or privilege, it's about compassion and courage. Months later, as the city began to rebuild, Barron visited the Ramirezes in their temporary home. Their daughter hugged him tightly. "Thank you for saving us," she said. Barron smiled, his voice steady. "You're the reason we do this." The fires had left scars on the city, but they had also revealed its resilience and the strength of those willing to fight for others, no matter the cost. The mission into the fire zone had been perilous, but it proved that courage and determination could triumph even in the most dire circumstances. Barron Trump and the volunteers returned to the relief camp as heroes, greeted by the cheers and gratitude of the evacuees they had saved. Yet, the experience left an indelible mark on everyone involved, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. In the days that followed, the story of their bravery spread far and wide. News outlets highlighted the operation, not just as an act of heroism, but as a testament to the power of community and compassion. Social media buzzed with praise, using hashtags like #BarronTheLeader and #FireZoneHeroes to celebrate their efforts. Barron, however, remained humble. When asked about his role, he simply said, "I did what anyone should do when they see someone in need." This wasn't about being a hero, it was about doing what was right. The fires eventually subsided, leaving behind scars on the landscape and in the hearts of those who had lived through them. But the relief camp became a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could be accomplished when people came together for a common cause. Barron continued to work tirelessly, using his platform to raise awareness for wildfire victims and advocate for better disaster preparedness. The connections he made during the crisis became the foundation for ongoing efforts to support vulnerable communities. As the city began to rebuild, the Ramirez family approached Barron one final time to thank him. Sophia handed him a drawing she had made, a picture of their family standing in front of the trucks, with flames in the background and a banner that read, "Thank you for saving us." Barron smiled, holding the picture close. "This is why we do what we do," he said softly. The journey had been grueling, but it was one that left an undeniable legacy. In the face of unimaginable adversity, a young leader emerged, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope and humanity can shine brighter than the flames.